You bring shame to this family. Get out of my sight!
The little girl wept, her voice cracking as she begged, "Please, don't make us stay here." The afternoon sun hammered down on the Los Alamos estate, a relentless blaze that made the white entrance columns shine with a blinding, painful intensity. It was a drought bringer, a dry heat that fractured the soil and broke the spirit of any living thing unlucky enough to be caught without the shelter of the massive oak trees, or, for the masters of the house, the central cooling system that kept the mansion in an eternal, artificial European spring. But out on the front lawn, right at the base of the pitch, limestone steps leading to the carved mahogany entrance, there was no sanctuary. The air wasn't peaceful. It was vibrating with a dangerous electric rage. The lazy drone of the cicadas shattered instantly under a piercing shriek that ricocheted off the manor walls. "Get the hell out of there, you filthy gutter rat." The voice was feminine but warped, teetering on the edge of unhinged hysteria. Isabella stood on the cobblestone path, looking like she had just stepped off a high-fashion magazine cover. Her blood-red silk dress clung to her frame like a second skin, a violent splash of color against the manicured green perfection of the gardens. Her voluminous chestnut hair whipped around with her, frantic movements as she jabbed a lethal, perfectly manicured finger toward the shrubbery. She was pointing at a rotting eyesore hidden by the gardenias, an abandoned doghouse. The structure was a decaying relic of rustic timber, grayed and splintered by years of sun and rain. The varnish had peeled away long ago, leaving the raw wood exposed to the elements. It was an ugly blemish on such a pristine estate, but the peeling paint wasn't the problem. It was the contents of that dark box that made the blood run cold. Jammed inside the cramped, shadowy interior, curled into a tight ball like a prey animal waiting for the predator's teeth, was Maribel. The child couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Dust matted her light brown hair, which was held back by a faded pink ribbon that had seen better days. Her polka-dot dress, once white and pink, was now a map of sweat and dried mud. She hugged her scraped, bleeding knees to her chest, trying to make herself small enough to disappear inside that unworthy shelter. But Maribel wasn't alone in the filth. Her spindly arms, trembling from exhaustion and hunger, formed an iron cage around a bundle wrapped in sky-blue cloth. A newborn baby slept there, oblivious to the chaos, breathing with the shallow, fragile rhythm of a life hanging by a thread. "Are you deaf?" Isabella screamed again, slamming her palm against the wooden roof, sending a shower of sawdust down on the trembling girl. "Crawl out before I release the hounds to drag you out by your ankles. You make me sick." Maribel let out a choked, guttural sob and squeezed the infant tighter, shutting her eyes as if blocking out the woman in red would make the monster vanish. Tears cut clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Just as the cruelty of the scene peaked, the heavy thud of boots on stone froze the moment in time. From the top of the death staircase, emerging from the deep shadows of the monumental porch, came Don Alejandro, the master of the house. At 55, he was the kind of man who filled a room without uttering a single syllable. Clad in a crisp white shirt with rolled sleeves and dark trousers cinched by a silver-buckled belt, he looked every bit the land baron. A pristine cream Stetson, shaded eyes that were usually hard as flint. His gaze had been tempered by decades of cutthroat business deals and self-inflicted isolation. In his weathered hands, Alejandro clutched a large box adorned with a massive red bow. It was an early anniversary gift for Isabella, a diamond necklace that cost a small fortune, purchased with the desperate hope of buying a little warmth for a home that, despite its grandeur, felt increasingly like a mausoleum. Alejandro froze on the top step. His practiced smile evaporated instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer bewilderment. His eyes darted from his shrieking fiancée to the target of her wrath. He expected a lazy gardener or a stray mutt. What he actually saw made the expensive box in his hands feel suddenly heavy and completely obscene. His gaze landed on the weathered doghouse, a relic he'd meant to tear down years ago. But instead of emptiness, he found a pair of petrified eyes staring back at him. A child. She peered out from the rotting gloom, shrinking away as if he were an executioner arriving to deliver a death sentence. The wind rustled the leaves, but neither of them flinched. A knot tightened in the pit of Alejandro's stomach, a visceral punch he couldn't quite name. The tableau was wrong, grotesquely so. The sheer extravagance of his estate clashed violently with the destitution huddled inside that crate. And his mind stalled, struggling to reconcile the two. Isabella spotted him immediately. Her expression shifted in a heartbeat. The predator's snarl vanished, instantly replaced by the mask of a fragile, offended victim. She spun toward him, clutching her chest and gasping for air, acting as though she were the one under attack. "Alejandro, thank God you're here," she cried out, her trembling tone doing a poor job of masking the venom underneath. "Look at this mess. The things we have to put up with. It's just unbelievable." Alejandro remained silent. He descended another step, his boot striking the stone with a heavy, authoritative thud. He didn't spare Isabella a glance. His focus was locked on the girl, the grime on her skin, that faded blue blanket, and the way she tried to shrink into the shadows of the doghouse. "What exactly is going on here, Isabella?" he asked, his deep baritone rolling across the courtyard. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. It was the voice of a man who expected nothing less than the absolute truth. Inside the crate, the girl flinched at the sound. She lifted her head tentatively, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. A chill raced down Alejandro's spine, a strange wave of irrational familiarity that shook him to his core, though he couldn't place why. The tension hanging in the air was thick enough to choke on. Sensing she was losing control of the narrative, Isabella scrambled up the steps, hurrying to cut him off. She tried to block his line of sight, as if the child's mere existence were a smudge on her pristine red gown. "She's a thief, Alejandro!" she shrieked. She jabbed a finger behind her, sneering. "I caught her lurking around the back kitchen. Probably after the silver, or trying to snag your watch collection. The second she saw me, she scurried off like the rat she is and crawled in there. Refuses to come out." Alejandro furrowed his brow, trying to piece it all together. He glanced at the gift box he was gripping, then back at the girl. A thief? The poor thing looked like she barely had the strength to hold her head up, let alone haul a bag of heavy silverware. "A thief?" Alejandro echoed, his voice dripping with skepticism. He took the remaining stairs slowly, landing on the ground level. "Yes, just look at her face," Isabella pressed. "She's one of those drifters, probably a grifter looking to prey on decent people." She trailed him closely. Her heels clicked against the stone like gunshots. "I told her to beat it, but she just stared at me. The insolence. You need to call the cops, Alejandro. Better yet, let the Dobermans loose. Teach them they can't just waltz onto private property." At the mention of the dogs, a whimper of pure terror escaped the girl's lips. She scrambled deeper into the shadows, scraping her spine against the splintered wood. Then she spoke, her voice brittle from thirst and tears. No, we didn't steal anything. I swear." The desperation in her cry was gut-wrenching. Alejandro halted about 6 feet from the entrance. The stench of mold and unwashed skin assaulted him, mingling bizarrely with Isabella's expensive, sickly sweet perfume. It was a stomach-turning mix, wealth and poverty colliding in the most visceral way possible. "Shut your mouth, you lying little brat," Isabella snapped, lunging toward the crate. "Enough, Isabella." Alejandro's command cracked like a whip. It was the first time he'd raised his voice, and the sharpness of it froze the woman in her tracks, her mouth hanging open. "Let her speak." He turned his gaze back to the girl. From this range, he could spot the details Isabella was too blind to see. He saw lips that were cracked and parched from severe dehydration. He noted the uncontrollable shaking of her hands and the bundle she was clutching. That wasn't a stash of stolen goods. "What have you got there?" Alejandro asked, nodding toward the blue blanket. His tone remained guarded. Years of fending off con artists had made suspicion his default setting. The girl, Maribel, stared up at him, her large eyes swimming with honey-colored tears. She hugged the bundle tighter against her chest before painfully peeling back a corner of the fabric. She pulled the blanket down just enough to reveal the pale, waxy face of a newborn. Alejandro felt the breath get knocked right out of him. A baby. It's my baby brother. I'm just a kid. And then, summoning every ounce of courage left in her tiny frame, she screamed the words that would shatter his world. Words that would haunt Alejandro until his dying breath. "Please, mister, the lady says we have to go, but we can't take another step." "Mama told us to come here." Maribel gasped, choking on her own tears, locking eyes with the billionaire. "Don't make us stay. We just wanted water. The baby won't wake up, and he's freezing. Please, don't let the dogs eat us." The plea hit Alejandro like a physical blow to the gut. "Mama told us to come here." The sentence hung heavy in the sweltering afternoon heat. He looked down at his own imported Italian leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine, not a speck of dust on them. Then his gaze shifted to the girl's feet, protruding from the doghouse. Bare, caked in black scabs, toenails broken and bloody. They had walked miles, endless miles. Isabella huffed, crossing her arms with unmistakable impatience. "Oh, spare me, Alejandro. It's the oldest trick in the book. They use kids as props to pull at your heartstrings and empty your wallet. It's a grift. Give them a sip of water, and by tomorrow their whole shantytown will be camping on your lawn. Get them out of my sight. I have guests arriving for dinner in an hour. If they see this, I'll die of embarrassment. They smell like manure." Isabella's cruelty, which Alejandro had previously tolerated or conveniently overlooked, suddenly struck a different chord. Shrill, malicious, evil. Alejandro stared at the gift in his hands. The flawless box, the crimson ribbon. Suddenly, it all felt so hollow. "She said the baby won't wake up," Alejandro murmured, speaking more to the universe than to Isabella. "Probably drugged him so he wouldn't cry. That's what these people do." Isabella lunged, delivering a sharp kick to the wooden structure. The hollow thud echoed, and the old kennel creaked ominously. "Come on, out!" The impact dislodged a piece of rotting timber from the roof, crashing down onto the girl's shoulder. Maribel screamed, curling up to shield the infant with her own body. "Enough!" Alejandro roared. The shout was so thunderous that a flock of birds erupted from the nearby bushes in panic. Alejandro let the gift box fall. The crunch of something expensive shattering inside, maybe the jewel case, maybe the gem itself, was audible. But he didn't give a damn. He took a long stride, closing the gap between a world of privilege, and the wretched misery before him. Isabella tried to grab his arm. "Alejandro, what are you doing? You'll ruin your suit." He shook her off with a jerk, almost violent, without even glancing at her. His entire focus was locked on the trembling child huddled inside the doghouse. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, not caring as mud and grass stained his tailored trousers. He was face to face with Maribel. Up close, the stench was overpowering. Yes, it smelled of stale sweat, sickness, and wet earth. But Alejandro, who had worked the fields long before becoming a tycoon, recognized another scent beneath the filth. The metallic tang of fear. "I'm not going to let the dogs hurt you," Alejandro said, his voice strangely husky. He tried to sound gentle, but it came out raspy. "You said your mama sent you here. Why? Who is your mother?" Maribel, sobbing uncontrollably, momentarily let go of the baby with one shaking hand to dig for something inside her dress. Her clumsy fingers fished out a crumpled envelope, stained with grease and humidity, looking like it had traveled hundreds of miles pressed against her skin. She said if she didn't wake up, I should give you this," the girl whispered, holding out the paper, flinching as if expecting a blow rather than a hand. "She said you lived in the big house with the white columns." Alejandro stared at the envelope. No name on it, just sealed with a strip of cheap tape. "Where is your mother now, child?" He asked the question, feeling a crushing weight on his chest, a dark premonition chilling his blood despite the heat. Maribel looked down. A fat tear splashed onto the sleeping baby's forehead. "She fell asleep by the side of the road 3 days ago." The girl's voice cracked into a heartbreaking sob. "I tried to wake her up, mister. I shook her hard, but she was so cold, and she wouldn't move anymore. I had to leave her there. I had to bring Angelito because he was hungry." The confession landed like an atomic bomb in the quiet garden. Isabella, poised to complain again, snapped her mouth shut, stunned into silence by the brutality of the truth. Alejandro felt the earth spin beneath him. This 9-year-old girl had walked alone, carrying a newborn, leaving her mother's corpse in some forgotten ditch, just to reach his doorstep. With hands that trembled visibly, Alejandro took the filthy envelope from the child. As he did, his knuckles grazed Maribel's skin. She was radiating heat like a furnace. Alejandro handled the grimy envelope by the corner, treating it with the extreme caution reserved for live grenades. It was cheap pulp, coarse enough to grate against fingertips softened by years of signing 7-figure contracts and swirling brandy snifters. A grease stain on the edge seemed to mock the starch-stiff purity of his collar, though for once, spotless presentation was the last thing on his mind. The afternoon heat spiked, becoming oppressive. The atmosphere turned dense, suffocatingly thick, heavy with the copper tang of dried blood and the unmistakable scent of despair drifting from the girl's makeshift shelter. Isabella, shaking off the momentary paralysis of the girl's admission, snapped back into offensive mode, fueled by a distinct social terror that frightened her far more than the prospect of death itself. She closed the distance to Alejandro, whipping a scented silk handkerchief from her bodice to frantically scrub at a tiny speck of dust on his sleeve, as if wiping away the smudge could magically scrub these intruders from reality. "Alejandro, for the love of God, don't touch that thing," she hissed, a cocktail of revulsion and panic, lowering her volume just enough to keep the servants watching from the main house out of the loop. "The girl is hallucinating. A dead mother on the road? That is the oldest con in the book. It is a sob story designed to pick your pocket. Don't be a fool. The senator and his wife will be here in 40 minutes. If they see this filth on your lawn, we will be the punchline at the country club by sunrise." Isabella's words buzzed around Alejandro's head like irritating gnats. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the envelope. There was something in the penmanship, a tremor in the address, a specific curvature to the letter A that rang a bell in the deep recesses of his mind, resurrecting a ghost he thought he had buried under mounds of earth and cash 15 years ago. But then, the cold, jagged pragmatism that had crowned him the region's cattle king tried to seize the wheel. Isabella had a point. The planet didn't stop spinning just because a stranger had a bad day. He had a gala to host, a reputation to polish. Compassion was an expensive hobby men of his stature rarely indulged in. Alejandro let out a sharp breath of frustration, his jaw setting into a hard line. He shoved the unopened letter into his back pocket. He didn't have the bandwidth for emotional theatrics right now. He would handle this the way he handled every problem, with a checkbook. Reaching into his blazer, he produced a heavy crocodile skin wallet, flipping it open to display a crisp regiment of high-value banknotes. "Isabella, get Ramirez on the line," Alejandro commanded, his voice flat and detached. "Tell him to bring the old pickup around. Have him drive the girl and the bundle to the county hospital. Tell him to cover all their medical bills, whatever it takes, and then hand them over to social services." Alejandro peeled off a thick wad of cash, likely more than this child had ever seen in her life, and crouched down, thrusting the bills toward the shadows of the shack. "Here." His tone was devoid of warmth, strictly business. "Take this. It is a lot of money. Go with my foreman. He will get your brother to a doctor. But you can't stay here. This isn't your home." Isabella exhaled a theatrical sigh of relief, folding her arms with a victor's smirk. "You see, darling?" She cooed at the girl, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "The master is being generous. Take the cash and thank your lucky stars we didn't just throw you out. You caught us on a good day." But what happened next froze Alejandro in place, his hand still suspended in the air. Maribel didn't even glance at the money. She didn't blink at the fortune fluttering in the gentle breeze. Her honey-colored eyes, burning bright with fever, locked onto Alejandro's face with a gravitas that defied her age and poverty. With agonizing slowness, the girl raised a grime-streaked hand and gently pushed Alejandro's offering away. "I don't want your paper," she rasped, her voice cracking from dehydration. "Mama didn't send me for papers. She said come for help." She cast a gaze down at the infant in her arms. The little angel was still. His chest barely rose. His skin was shifting from a waxy pallor to a terrifying shade of gray around the mouth. "He doesn't need money," Maribel sobbed, and a single tear splashed onto the $100 bill Alejandro was still clutching. He needs breath. Mama told me you had a heart. She promised you'd be the one to save him. So tell me, why are you throwing us out like trash?" That sentence, "Mama told me you had a heart," hit Alejandro harder than a fist to the gut. Standing there in his bespoke suit, offering cash to a barefoot child who wouldn't take it, he felt microscopic, utterly absurd. A searing wave of humiliation washed over him, a feeling he hadn't known since his days as a dirt-poor farmhand with zero prospects. Watching the clock tick and the drama drag on, Isabella finally snapped. "That is enough!" she shrieked, storming toward the gatehouse. "You ungrateful little brat! If you won't take the payout, we'll drag you out by force." "Ramirez!" she bellowed to the security chief. "Get this filth off my property. That thing is probably dead already, and I will not have a corpse ruining my wedding day." At the words, "dead already," Maribel let out a blood-curdling scream, clutching the infant so tight her grime-streaked knuckles turned bone white. "He's not dead," the girl wailed. "He's sleeping, just sleeping." Alejandro rose slowly, pocketing his wallet with numb, robotic motions. Inside his head, everything was spinning out of control. The girl refusing the payoff shattered his worldview. Con artists want cash. Desperate people want cash. But this child, she just wanted a life saved. He glanced at Isabella's flushed, furious face, then back to the guard booth. A primal instinct flared in his gut, screaming that he was about to make an unforgivable mistake. He could feel the envelope in his back pocket, burning through the fabric like a brand. "Mama told me you had a heart." Alejandro squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the coward's urge to retreat into the safety of his air-conditioned fortress. But the baby's silence was deafening, louder than Isabella's shrieking, louder than his own terror. Then came a whimper so faint it was barely a whisper on the wind. Yet to Alejandro, it roared like a clap of thunder. It was a wet, rattling gasp, the sound of tiny lungs failing. Maribel leaned over the bundle, gently shaking him. Angelito, please, wake up," she begged, her face twisted in sheer panic. "Sir, he can't breathe. It sounds like he's drowning." Isabella rolled her eyes, sick of the performance. She grabbed Alejandro's shoulder, her manicured claws digging into his shirt. "Alejandro, get inside," she ordered, her voice ice-cold and stripped of all humanity. "Let security handle this mess. If that brat dies on the property, it's a legal nightmare. Dump them back on the highway where they belong. It's not our problem. It's not your blood. It is not your blood." That last phrase triggered a detonator in Alejandro's mind. The envelope. The handwriting. He recoiled from Isabella as if her touch were poisonous, ripping the envelope from his back pocket. His hands shook, not from fear, but from a dark, surging rush of adrenaline. "Alejandro!" Isabella snapped. "What are you doing? Throw that trash away." Ignoring her, he tore the envelope open violently, abandoning all finesse. The aged paper gave way, and the contents spilled into his open palm. No long letter, just a single sheet of notebook paper folded into quarters, and an old, dog-eared photograph fading into sepia tones. The photo landed face up. Instantly, the world around Alejandro ceased to exist. The manicured garden, the sprawling mansion, Isabella's screeching voice, the oppressive heat, all of it. Everything blurred into gray tunnel vision, leaving only that image in agonizingly sharp focus. There he was, a much younger Alejandro, sun-weathered and wearing a smile he hadn't worn in decades, holding a beautiful, simple woman beneath a jacaranda tree. She was wearing a cheap cotton dress and had a single flower tucked behind her ear. Elena, The only woman who had ever loved him when all he had to his name were debts and shattered dreams. He had left her one rainy morning, lying to himself that it was for the best, when really it was just blind ambition. A scheme to marry the neighbor's wealthy daughter and merge their estates. Alejandro felt his knees buckle. A wave of vertigo hit him hard. With trembling fingers, he flipped the photograph. On the back, written in that same shaky scrawl, was a date, 8 months after his departure, and a name. Alejandro looked up from the paper to the guard booth. He no longer saw a filthy beggar girl. He saw Elena's eyes staring back at him. He traced the curve of her chin, identical to his own. He recognized his own hands in hers. Maribel was his daughter, the breath trapped in his throat. 15 years. For 15 years he had rotted in this gilded cage, hoarding wealth for a non-existent legacy, convinced he had no heir, while his own flesh and blood starved in the dirt. "Get away from him!" Isabella's voice cut through the air, sharp, concerned. But the worry wasn't for Alejandro. It was for the bizarre look on his face. "What is that? Mugshots of her little gang?" She lunged for the picture. "Let me see." "Don't touch it!" Alejandro roared. The sound didn't come from his throat. It erupted from his gut, primal and terrifying. Isabella stumbled back 2 steps, nearly twisting her ankle in those ridiculous heels. Alejandro unfolded the crumpled sheet, his fingers feeling as heavy and cold as lead pipes. The note was short, the scrawl shaky and jagged, the handwriting of a woman using her very last ounce of strength on her deathbed. "Alejandro, I never wanted to burden you. I swore I'd stay out of your big, important life, but time has run out. The cancer isn't waiting anymore. Maribel is yours. She has your eyes, your stubbornness. The baby boy, that is my grandson. His mother died in childbirth, and the father took off. I am dying, Alejandro. I have no one left to turn to. Forgive me for breaking my word, but I cannot watch them starve. I am giving you back your daughter. Please, love her the way you never could love me. Elena." A single, searing tear splattered against the paper, smearing the ink right over the words, "Love her." Alejandro looked up. Maribel watched him with terror in her eyes, awaiting her sentence. The bundle in her arms let out a dry, hacking cough, then went disturbingly silent. Isabella, finding her composure and her cruelty, sneered at the pathetic tableau. Seeing Alejandro frozen, she decided to take matters into her own manicured hands. She marched over to the makeshift shelter and kicked the structure in a fit of rage. The rotten wood splintered, snapping dangerously close to the girl's temple. "I am done with this little theater production," Isabella shrieked, her face twisted and ugly with hate. "If he doesn't have the guts to throw you out, I will. Get lost. Take your dying bastard and your sob story with you. I bet your mother was just some cheap tramp who slept with half the town for cash." Time seemed to stop dead. The words, "cheap tramp," hung in the stagnant air. Inside Alejandro's mind, something finally snapped. It was the sound of his patience, his tolerance, and his entire superficial life shattering into 1,000 irreparable shards. The ice-cold tycoon evaporated. In his place stood a father, a man finally waking up from a long, selfish slumber. Alejandro spun toward Isabella with terrifying speed, his expression morphing into something out of the Old Testament, pure, biblical wrath. "Shut your mouth!" His voice was thunder, shaking the very dust of the valley. Isabella froze, jaw unhinged, her finger still pointing accusingly at the shack. In 3 years together, he had never once raised his voice at her, let alone like this. Alejandro stormed into her personal space, forcing her backward step by step until her spine slammed against a stone pillar. "Don't you dare," he whispered, his voice trembling with barely contained violence as he jabbed the photo of Elena toward her face. "Do not ever speak ill of her again. That woman had more dignity in her little finger than you have in your entire jewelry-draped body." "But Alejandro, she's just a vagrant," Isabella stammered, her face pale beneath the layers of makeup. That vagrant is my daughter. Alejandro bellowed the truth, a roar of liberation tearing from his chest. She is my blood, and the woman you're trashing was the only person who ever truly loved me. Absolute silence descended. The staff, watching from a distance, stood like statues. Inside the shack, Maribel stopped crying for a heartbeat, staring wide-eyed at the giant man in the cowboy hat. Daughter. Alejandro turned his back on Isabella, dismissing her as if she had simply ceased to exist. The senator, the dinner, the wedding, the gossip, none of it mattered anymore. He ran toward the shack. All doubt vanished. The disgust for the filth was gone. He crashed to his knees, ripping the fabric of his dress pants on the rocks, and reached into the darkness. Maribel. His voice cracked, soft and filled with infinite pain. It's me, honey. It's Dad. I'm so sorry. The girl looked at him, confused. She was terrified, yet in this stranger's eyes, she saw a reflection of her own suffering. Dad? She whispered, unable to believe it. Yes, my love, it's me. Alejandro didn't wait another second. Ignoring the splinters and the tight squeeze, he forced his way into the shelter. His large, powerful hands wrapped around the girl and the baby with the utmost tenderness. He felt his daughter's fragile frame trembling against his chest. He felt the burning fever radiating from the infant. They smelled of the road, of old sweat, and of impending death. But to Alejandro, in that moment, they smelled like redemption. He pulled them from the darkness, lifting them into the sunlight, as if they were the rarest treasures in the universe. Maribel clung to his neck, burying her face in his crisp white shirt, sobbing with a relief that tore at her soul. Alejandro stood up with his precious burden. But the baby, the little angel, lay dangerously limp in his left arm. The wheezing sound of his breath was a jagged, terrifying rattle. Isabella shook off her shock and played her final desperate card. Alejandro, listen to me. If you bring those wild animals inside, I'm leaving. I refuse to live under the same roof as that. Make your choice right now. It's them or me. Alejandro paused for a heartbeat. He turned slowly to face her. With his daughter clinging to his neck and his dying grandson cradled in his arms, he looked at the woman in red. All he saw was synthetic beauty wrapping a heart of ice. Get out, he said. His tone was calm, final. And don't take a single thing I paid for. The car stays, the jewelry stays. Get off my property. Now! Without waiting for a retort, Alejandro stormed up the stone steps 2 at a time, bellowing with a force that rattled the mansion's windows. Ramirez, get the car ready. Call Dr. Valadares. Tell him to get here immediately. And someone prep the master bedroom. My grandson is dying. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind him with a boom that signaled the end of an era and the birth of a new one. Isabella stood alone in the garden under the merciless sun, watching her perfect little world crumble into dust without a sound. The thunderous crash of the mahogany doors closing behind Alejandro exploded through the mansion's immense foyer like a cannon blast. The sound ricocheted off the Venetian stucco walls and spiraled upward, reaching the glass dome overhead, shattering the stillness of a house that had been, until that moment, a cold, silent mausoleum. Inside, the climate-controlled air was set to a flawless temperature, a brutal contrast to the suffocating heat blazing just outside the walls. The air carried the scent of beeswax, flowers cut just that morning, and that distinct, sterile aroma of a place where money is abundant, but life is scarce. But that immaculate order was violently shattered the instant they crossed the threshold. Alejandro stormed down the central hall, his boots stamping mud and dried earth onto the polished Italian marble that shone like a mirror. He didn't give a damn. Maribel clung to his neck, her eyes wide with terror and awe, while he held the little angel in his left arm. Feeling the baby's fever burning through his silk shirt, which was now stained with sweat and grime. "Juana! Marta!" Alejandro roared, his hoarse voice bouncing down the empty corridors. "Where the hell are you? I need help." The staff, trained to be neither seen nor heard, materialized like frightened ghosts. Juana, the housekeeper, A sturdy woman of 60, with a pristine white apron and gray hair and a tight bun, rushed out of the kitchen wiping her hands. Trailing behind her was Marta, a young maid with eyes like saucers. Seeing their patron, usually so distant and impeccable, burst in, disheveled, clothes torn, filthy, and carrying two children who looked like specters of poverty. Juana covered her mouth to stifle a scream. "Holy Mother of God," the woman whispered, running toward them. "Don Alejandro, what happened? Who are these poor creatures?" "Save the questions, Juana," he barked, though his eyes pleaded for help. "Get hot water, clean towels, alcohol. Bring whatever you can find, and make sure Dr. Valadares is on his way. Tell him it's life or death." Alejandro reached the main salon, a cavernous room filled with French-style furniture, upholstered in cream and gold velvet. Without a moment's hesitation, he marched toward the largest, most expensive sofa, the one Isabella had shipped from Europe and strictly forbidden anyone from sitting on without formal evening wear. Seeing the pristine white fabric, Maribel stiffened in Alejandro's arms. "No, no," the girl sobbed, trying to pull away. "I'm going to ruin it. The lady will be so mad. It's all white, sir. I'm too dirty." The innocence and fear in her voice, worrying about a piece of furniture while her brother was dying in her arms, shattered what was left of Alejandro's heart. "To hell with the sofa," he roared, lowering her with infinite gentleness onto the velvet cushions. The dirt from her feet and the grime on her dress instantly stained the costly fabric, leaving dark, ugly smears. To Alejandro, it was the most beautiful masterpiece he had ever seen. "This is your home, Maribel. You can dirty whatever you want. You can tear it all down if you feel like it." Alejandro laid little Angelito down beside her. The baby looked like a broken doll against the vastness of the sofa. His skin had taken on a worrying grayish hue under the light of the crystal chandeliers. Juana came running back with a basin of water and cloths. As she approached the sofa and caught a glimpse of the girl's face, she froze in her tracks. The basin trembled in her hands, splashing water onto the floor. The old housekeeper, who had served this estate since before Alejandro froze. There was no mistaking that gaze. Those honey-colored irises were a ghost from his past. They belonged to Elena. "Don Alejandro." Juana's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes darting between her employer and the ragged girl. "It's her, isn't it? It's really her." "Yes, Juana." Alejandro's voice cracked. He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive Persian rug, his trembling hand reaching out to touch the infant's scorching forehead. "That is my daughter. And this is my grandson. If we don't act now, we're going to lose them." The words hit the older woman like a jolt of electricity. In a split second, her stun evaporated, replaced instantly by steely resolve and decades of maternal instinct. Formalities and social rank vanished. Juana hit the floor beside Alejandro, transforming from housekeeper to field medic. "Marta, rubbing alcohol in cold compresses now," she barked, channeling a drill sergeant. "And get me warm milk, spoon only, no cups. Move!" While the staff scrambled, Maribel remained curled up against the sofa cushions, shaking violently. The brutal transition to the mansion's air conditioning, combined with sheer exhaustion and terror, had sent her into shock. "I'm so cold," she stammered, her teeth chattering audibly. Alejandro bolted upright, scanning the room frantically. He spotted a folded cashmere throw on the armchair, but shook his head. It was too thin, too flimsy for how much she was shivering. He pivoted and sprinted for the staircase, taking the steps two at a time as he raced toward the master suite. He tore into his walk-in closet like a tornado, desperately hunting for something heavy, something that promised warmth and safety. He snatched his thickest down comforter off the shelf, a massive, fluffy cloud of warmth, and flew back downstairs. Back in the living room, the scene was terrifyingly quiet. Juana was gently wiping Angelito's face with a damp cloth, but the infant wasn't crying. He was barely moving at all. "Sir," Juana murmured, her gaze fixed intently on the baby's tiny chest. It was rising and falling in a jagged, wheezing rhythm. "He's in bad shape. You can hear the wheeze in his lungs. This isn't just starvation." Alejandro felt the world tilt on its axis. Swallowing his panic, he draped the massive comforter over Maribel, tucking her in until she was swaddled in a giant, protective cocoon. He sank onto the edge of the sofa and gently took her hand. Her fingers felt impossibly small and bony, engulfed within his large palms. "The doctor is on his way, sweetheart," he lied smoothly, projecting a calm he didn't feel. "He's going to fix Angelito, I promise you." Maribel peered out from the depths of the duvet. Her eyes, wiped clean of grime, burned with a feverish intensity. "Why are you crying?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Alejandro touched his cheek, startled by the moisture. He hadn't even realized the tears were falling. "Because I wasted so much time, sweetheart," he admitted, indifferent to the staff listening in. "I threw away 15 years. The front door swung open, interrupting the moment. But it wasn't the doctor. It was Isabella. She stormed in like a hurricane, mascara smeared from heat and rage, pausing under the archway to catch her breath. Spotting the ragged strangers on her imported velvet, she shrieked, shattering the tense silence. "Look at my sofa! Is it ruined?" She pointed an accusing finger at the muddy smears. "Alejandro, I've had it. The senator will be here in 20 minutes. Get that trash out of here, or I swear." Alejandro rose slowly. He didn't scream. His silence was far more terrifying. He stalked toward her with deadly purpose, while Juana pulled Maribel close, shielding the child from the woman's glare. Alejandro stopped inches from Isabella's face, staring at her like she was a stranger. Or worse, a pest that needed exterminating. "Why are you still here?" he whispered dangerously. "This is my house too. Our wedding is in a month." "There is no wedding." His voice was ice cold. "And this was never your home. You were just a guest who overstayed her welcome. Juana, call security, have them escort her out and toss her luggage on the curb." Isabella opened her mouth to scream, to threaten, to fight back. But Alejandro's eyes were dead voids, stripped of all affection, freezing her in place. The truth finally hit her. The game was over. Her beauty and manipulation were useless against the bond of blood. She spun around and fled, her heels clacking sharply against the marble floor, dragging away the poison that had infected the house for years. Alejandro didn't even watch her go. He was already back at the sofa, on his knees beside his children, just as sirens began to wail up the driveway. Dr. Valladares burst into the room, medical bag in hand, with 2 paramedics right on his heels. He was Alejandro's contemporary, his weathered face set in professional lines that couldn't quite mask his concern. He had known Alejandro since they were boys, and in 50 years, he had never seen him like this. Kneeling in the dirt, clutching a stranger's hand, his shirt undone and his face twisted in sheer terror. "Where's the patient?" Valladares barked, skipping the pleasantries. "There's 2 of them, Roberto. 2, Alejandro answered, rising from his chair and stepping aside to clear a path. "It's the baby I'm scared about. He's completely unresponsive." The doctor approached the sofa, glancing first at Maribel, who eyed him warily and burrowed deeper under the quilt. She's severely dehydrated, showing clear evidence of heat stroke and starvation. He made the assessment in seconds after checking her pulse and noting her dilated pupils. She needs IV fluids and total bed rest, but she's a fighter. Her body can handle the recovery. Then his gaze shifted to the tiny blue bundle. Little angel. The silence in the room turned heavy, almost suffocating, as Valladares pulled out his stethoscope and pressed the cold metal against the infant's bare, rib-cage-showing chest. The only noise was the low hum of the AC and Alejandro's jagged breathing. He stood there, waiting for the diagnosis, like a convict waiting for the judge's gavel. Valladares furrowed his brow, sliding the stethoscope to the baby's back. He lifted one of the child's eyelids with his thumb and gently pressed on the abdomen. Every passing second felt like physical torture to Alejandro. Finally, the doctor pulled the earpieces out and locked eyes with Alejandro. His face was grim, stone cold, with zero reassurance. "Alejandro, we need to move him. Now." Alejandro felt his knees buckle. He grabbed the back of an armchair to stay upright. "What is it?" he choked out. "Advanced pneumonia, complicated by severe malnutrition and critical dehydration, Valadares explained, speaking in a rapid-fire clip while signaling the paramedics to prep the pediatric stretcher. His lungs are full of fluid. He's going into respiratory failure. Look at his lips, Alejandro. That blue tint? It's cyanosis. His brain isn't getting oxygen. If we don't get a tube in him within the hour, his heart is going to stop. Hearing the word heart and seeing strangers swarming her brother, Maribel let out a gut-wrenching scream and threw herself over the baby, shielding him with her own body. "No, don't take him!" the girl shrieked hysterically, kicking out at the doctor. "Mama said we have to stay together. He's mine. Don't take him away. No!" Alejandro lunged forward, not to pull her away, but to hold her together. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pinning her flailing arms. "Listen to me, sweetheart. Listen." The girl wept and fought him with the terrifying strength of pure desperation. "They're gonna kill him. The lady in red said he was dead. Don't let them take him." "Nobody's going to hurt him." Alejandro turned her around to face him. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Look at me, Maribel. Look me in the eye." The girl froze, gasping for air, her face drenched in tears. "I am your father," Alejandro said, the words carrying a sacred weight. "And I would die before I let anything bad happen to you two. The doctor is my friend. He's going to help Angelito breathe. You have to let them take him to the hospital. I'm going with him. You're going with him. Nobody gets left behind. Do you believe me?" Maribel searched the eyes of this stranger who claimed to be her father. She looked for the lie, for the cruelty she had seen in so many people during their journey. But all she found was a painful truth and a love born from deep regret. "Promise he won't die," she sobbed. Alejandro felt a lump in his throat so big he could barely speak. He couldn't promise that. He wasn't God, but he was a man with endless resources and a will of iron. "I promise I will fight. I promise he won't be alone," he replied. Maribel nodded slowly and let go of the baby. The paramedics moved instantly. They fitted a tiny oxygen mask over Angelito's small face. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and loaded him onto the portable stretcher. "Juana, get in the ambulance with the girl," Alejandro ordered, taking charge again. "I'll follow in my car with the doctor." "No." Maribel grabbed Alejandro's hand tight. Her small fingers dug into the rancher's calloused hand. "Not you. You come with me. Don't leave me alone." That touch, that desperate demand for his presence, shattered Alejandro's last defense. She didn't want his money. She didn't care about the house. She wanted him. Despite the abandonment, despite being a stranger, she needed him. Alejandro looked at Valladares. "I'm riding in the ambulance," Alejandro stated. "Alejandro, that's not protocol," the doctor started. "To hell with protocol, Roberto," Alejandro exploded. "That's my grandson, and that's my daughter. I'll buy the damn ambulance if I have to, but I am not leaving their side." The doctor nodded, realizing no force on earth could move Alejandro when he got like this. "Let's move. Every minute counts." The scene that followed was a blur of flashing blue lights and sirens. Alejandro climbed into the back of the rig, squeezing himself onto the narrow bench. Back at the estate, Juana stood paralyzed, sobbing prayers into the silence as she watched the taillights fade into the darkness. The roar inside the speeding rig was deafening, yet Alejandro's gaze remained locked on his children. Maribel sat slumped beside him, tethered to an IV line the medic had hooked up in a blur of motion. Her head rested heavy on Alejandro's arm, totally spent, surrendering to sleep now that she felt a sliver of safety. One hand gripped his daughter's shoulder, while the other white-knuckled the stretcher rail, right where little Angelito fought for every single breath. The heart monitor chirped a frantic, uneven rhythm, way too fast. "Beep, beep, pip. Hang in there, champ," Alejandro whispered, leaning close to the infant. He brushed the baby's cheek with the back of his knuckle. The skin felt cold and clammy. Glancing out the rear window, he watched his mansion shrinking away, becoming nothing but a speck in the distance. That estate, the very thing he'd traded his youth and love to build, now looked like nothing more than a hollow tomb. "Elena," Alejandro murmured into the void, squeezing his eyes shut as guilt ate him alive. "If you can hear me, Don't take him. Take me instead. Take the fortune, the land, all of it, but leave him be. Let me fix this." Suddenly, the monitor's rhythm shifted. It turned into a high-pitched, unending drone. The flat line. The medic sprang up. "Going into arrest," the man shouted. "Doc, the baby's crashing." Maribel jolted awake with a scream. Alejandro felt his own heart seize up in his chest. The whole world went red. "Do something!" Alejandro roared as the doctor began pressing 2 fingers into his grandson's tiny chest. The ambulance swerved hard, flooring the accelerator. Alejandro pulled Maribel tight against him, shielding her eyes and ears, forced to watch in horror as his only heir's life hung by a thread, battling death on a dark highway. It was the cost of his ambition, finally calling in the debt with interest. Tires screeched violently, sounding like they were tearing the night apart as the brakes locked, throwing everyone against their seatbelts. The back doors flew open before they even fully stopped, exposing the loading dock of the Central Hospital ER, bathed in harsh, blinding white fluorescent light. "Pediatric code blue! Move, move, move!" the medic yelled, jumping onto the asphalt and yanking the stretcher out with desperate force. Dazed by the sudden stop and the panic, Alejandro fumbled with his buckle. He looked at Maribel, curled up on the side bench, staring into nothingness, frozen by terror. "Hold on to me, sweetheart," Alejandro commanded, pulling her up. He didn't wait for a wheelchair. Scooping her into his arms with the IV line dangling dangerously, he sprinted after Angelito's stretcher. The emergency hallway was organized chaos. Doctors and nurses dashed every which way, but the swarm around little Angelito moved as a single, tight unit. A wall of white coats hiding the baby's tiny body. Alejandro craned his neck, trying to make sense of it, but he only caught fragments of terrifying commands. "Still in asystole, push epi, 1 amp. Now, prep for intubation. Tube size 3.5, no pulse, keep compressions going." Those words, "no pulse," pierced Alejandro's brain like shards of glass. He ran until he hit the double-swinging doors marking the trauma bay entrance, driven by a visceral need to be there, to protect, to command death to back off. He tried to shove inside, but a strong arm stopped him cold. "Sir, you cannot go in there," a sturdy nurse shouted, physically blocking his path. "That is my grandson," Alejandro bellowed, face flushing red, neck veins bulging. "I have money. I'll pay anything. Get the best specialists in the country. Buy the whole hospital if you have to. Just let me in." The nurse didn't flinch an inch, eyeing him with a mix of pity and iron will. "Your money is worthless in there, sir. Right now, only the doctor's hands and God's will matter. If you go in, you get in the way. If you get in the way, the boy dies. Stay here." The brutal truth hit him harder than any fist. Alejandro stumbled back a step. Him, Alejandro Montoya, the man who moved mountains with a single phone call, the landowner nobody dared refuse, was completely useless. His platinum card, his acres of land, his connections. It was all garbage against the fragility of a 3-kilogram heart refusing to beat. The doors swung shut in his face, hiding the frantic battle for Angelito's life. Alejandro stood alone in the sterile corridor, gasping for air, as if the hospital atmosphere itself had turned poisonous. A gentle tug on his shirt broke his trance. He looked down. Maribel stood shivering on the freezing linoleum, her bare feet pale against the tiles. The oversized hospital gown from the ambulance hung loosely off her fragile frame. Her eyes were dry. She had nothing left to weep. Instead, a violent, rhythmic shivering had taken over, rattling her entire body. "Is he gone?" she asked. The tone was hollow, stripped of all emotion. It was the sound of a child who had seen enough death to stop fearing it and start expecting it. That simple question shattered Alejandro's heart completely. Ignoring the staring strangers in the waiting room, he dropped to his knees and wrapped her icy hands in his. "No," he stated, forcing a fierce certainty into his voice, willing it to be true. "He's not gone. He's fighting. He's a Montoya, Maribel. We're made of iron. We don't quit." The girl stared at the swinging double doors. "Mom fought too," she whispered. She fought really hard, but she still turned cold. Angelito felt cold in the ambulance, too. Alejandro pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying her face in his chest to hide his own agony. He won't stay cold. I'm here now. I won't let the darkness take him. Minutes dragged by, feeling like entire lifetimes. 10 minutes became 20, then 30. Every ticking second was agonizing. Alejandro paced the floor like a caged predator, while Maribel sat on a rigid plastic chair, swinging legs that were too short to touch the ground. He checked his phone. 20 missed calls from Isabella, 10 from the legal team, and 5 from the foreman. Snarling, he powered the device down. The outside world didn't matter. Only this hallway existed. Finally, the doors swung open, and Dr. Valadares emerged. He had stripped off his surgical gown, revealing sweat-stained scrubs. His face was ashen, drained of all vitality. He rubbed his eyes wearily before locking eyes with the father. Alejandro lunged forward. "Roberto, talk to me. Tell me now." Valladares let out a heavy, shuddering sigh. "He's alive, Alejandro." Alejandro exhaled the breath he'd been holding for 30 minutes, a sound halfway between a moan and a sob. His knees buckled, and he slumped against the wall for support. "However," the doctor added, raising a hand to temper the relief, "we're not out of the woods yet." He flatlined for 3 minutes. That's an eternity for a developing brain. We restarted his heart, but his vitals are incredibly fragile. He's in a medically induced coma on life support, with a cocktail of drugs keeping his blood pressure stable. The doctor stepped closer, gripping his friend's shoulder. "Tonight is the turning point. If he survives until dawn, we have a fighting chance. But Alejandro, I need you to be realistic. Even if he pulls through, there could be permanent damage. The oxygen deprivation—" "I don't care," Alejandro interrupted, straightening his spine, his eyes burning with resolve. "I don't care about complications. I don't care if I have to push his wheelchair forever or build a private hospital just for his recovery. I just need him to live. I need him to breathe." Valadares nodded, struck by the change in the man before him. "We'll do everything we can. Now look after the girl. She needs you." "She's starving, dehydrated, and in severe shock. I've arranged a private suite in the pediatric wing. Take her upstairs. Let her sleep. There's nothing you can do in the ICU right now anyway." Alejandro glanced at Maribel. She had collapsed into sleep on the plastic chair, totally overcome by exhaustion. She looked impossibly small and brittle. "Thank you, Roberto," Alejandro said, shaking the doctor's hand with a firm grip. "Thank you for saving my life." Alejandro walked over to his daughter and scooped her up gently, careful not to disturb her slumber. She let out a soft sigh and rested her head against his shoulder, instinctively seeking his warmth. As he walked toward the elevator, leaving the chaos of the ER behind, Alejandro caught his reflection in a glass panel. He saw a man in a ruined, multi-thousand-dollar suit, stained with mud, tears, and blood that wasn't his own. He looked disheveled, aged, and hollow-eyed. Yet, for the first time in 15 years, he didn't see a ghost staring back. He saw a father. Room 502 in the pediatric ward felt nothing like a medical facility. It resembled a 5-star hotel suite, featuring pastel walls, cloud-patterned curtains, and a large, flat-screen TV. Yet the sterile scent of antiseptic lingered, a sharp reminder of reality. Alejandro laid Maribel down on the plush, spacious bed. She sank into the mattress, a stark contrast to the hard ground or the rotting wood of the dog kennel she was used to. A young nurse slipped in silently to reconnect the IV and clean the cuts on the girl's feet with infinite tenderness. "I added a mild sedative to her drip," the nurse whispered to Alejandro. "She'll sleep through the night. She needs it. Her body is at its breaking point." Alejandro nodded, sinking into the leather armchair beside the bed. He hadn't flinched in 2 hours. Just stood there watching the steady rise and fall of his daughter's chest. He kept checking for the rise and fall of her chest, paralyzed by the irrational fear that death would sneak in the moment he blinked. As soon as the nurse stepped out, a heavy stillness swallowed the room. It was a crushing quiet, thick with accusation and ghosts. Alejandro stared down at his own hands. They were filthy, Grit was wedged deep under his fingernails, black soil from the manicured gardens of his estate, mud that Maribel had tracked in from God knows where. His focus shifted to the battered knapsack that had arrived with the girl. The fabric was faded to a non-color, stitched together in places with crude fishing line. It sat on the floor beside the bed, an ugly intruder violating the pristine luxury of the suite. Alejandro felt a pang of agonizing curiosity. That bag held his daughter's entire universe, everything she owned in this world. He reached down and hoisted it up. It was heartbreakingly light. He pulled the zipper with slow deliberation. The rasp of the metal teeth tore through the silence like a jagged blade. The top layer was clothing, a few soiled rags folded with heartbreaking care, and an adult's wool sweater, surely Elena's, used as a makeshift blanket. Alejandro buried his face in the coarse fabric. It still held her scent. It smelled of Elena, of cheap lavender water and wood smoke. That scent dragged him back 15 years, to nights in her cabin where he vowed they'd conquer the world together. A dry sob racked his chest. No tears came yet. He kept digging. He found half a pack of stale biscuits, a reused water bottle, and at the very bottom, wrapped in plastic against the rain, a hidden treasure. Alejandro unwrapped the bundle. It was a cheap, spiral-bound school notebook. The cover was plastered with crayon art. Maribel and Mommy's diary was scrawled across the front. Alejandro flipped it open, his hands shaking. He wasn't sure he had the right to read it, but the need to know was overpowering. He had to understand the hell they endured while he sat on his terrace sipping aged whiskey. The first few pages were childish sketches. A house, a tree, a smiling sun, and a tall figure in a hat. "This is my daddy," read the scrawl beneath the man. "Mommy says he is a king who lives in a castle. She says he's working hard so we can have everything when we get there. She says he loves me very much, even though we haven't met." Alejandro squeezed his eyes shut, clutching his chest. The physical pain was sharp, as if his heart had been ripped right out of his ribcage. Elena. She never poisoned the child against him. She never revealed he was a coward who ran away when she got pregnant. She had crafted a hero out of thin air. She gave their daughter a father to adore, even though the man himself didn't deserve a damn thing. He turned the pages. The handwriting shifted, becoming sharp and adult. Elena's hand. "Today, Maribel turned 7. We couldn't afford a cake, but I told her the story of how her father used to ride horses. Her eyes just light up when I talk about him. God, forgive me for lying, but I cannot break her heart by telling her he forgot us long ago. The doctor says there is nothing left to do. The lump in my stomach is agony. I am afraid, not for myself, but for her. And now I worry for the neighbor's baby we had to take in. I must get them to Alejandro. He is my only hope. I know if he sees the girl, his heart will soften. He wasn't a bad man, just ambitious." The final entry was barely legible, a scrawl marred by smudges. "I cannot walk any further. My legs refuse to move. We are close. I can see the city lights in the distance. Maribel is so brave. She carries the infant and helps me along. I told her I just need to rest a while. I know I won't wake up. God, look after my children. Alejandro, please, save them." The notebook slipped from his fingers to the floor. The man buried his face in his hands and wept. It was not a quiet weep. It was an ugly, guttural sound, a howling lament rising from the very depths of his soul. He wept for the years squandered. He wept for the woman who had loved him to the bitter end, protecting his legacy even as her life slipped away. He wept for the sheer cruelty of his own ignorance. He surged to his feet, knocking the armchair backward. A cold rage washed over him, fury at himself, but also a burning need to act. He could not save Elena now. She was gone, discarded in some roadside ditch as if she mattered nothing. But he could change what happened next. He pulled out his phone, which he had finally turned back on. He dialed his personal attorney, a man accustomed to receiving calls at ungodly hours to bury scandals. "Alejandro, it is 3 in the morning. Shut up and listen, Mendoza." Alejandro cut him off, his voice sounding like crushed gravel. I need a team. Get the best private investigators, your top contacts in the police force, and the funeral home. Now. Right now? What the hell happened? Did you run someone over? The lawyer asked, his voice spiking with panic. No, I'm saving a life. Alejandro walked to the window, gazing at the city lights. The last thing Elena saw before the end. I need you to recover a body. Her name was Elena. She passed away 3 or 4 days ago on the Old North Road, just a few miles from my estate. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. She's likely in the county morgue right now, tagged as a Jane Doe. No name. Or God forbid she's still lying out there. Just find her, Mendoza. His shout startled Maribel, causing her to shift in her sleep. Alejandro dropped his voice to a hiss, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. You track her down, and you bring her back to me. Hire the most exclusive funeral service money can buy. I want a mahogany casket, flowers, all of it. I want her treated like a queen. A heavy silence hung on the line. Who was she to you, Alejandro? Alejandro watched his daughter's sleeping reflection in the glass. She was my wife, he said, bestowing the title he had withheld while she was alive. The very title Isabella craved but would never possess. She was my real wife, and the mother of my children. Locate her, Mendoza. Bring her home. He ended the call. Alejandro unclasped the solid gold watch from his wrist. He stripped off the diamond cufflinks and cast them onto the nightstand with disdain, acting as if the jewels burned his skin. He rolled up the sleeves of his soil-stained shirt. He went to the ensuite basin, cupped his hands under the cold tap, and scrubbed his face, trying to wash away the tear tracks. Staring into the mirror, the glint of greed had vanished from his eyes. Now they held the dark weight of mourning and a terrifying clarity. He sat back down beside Maribel, clasping her hand and resting his forehead against her tiny, calloused fingers. Rest easy, sweetheart, he whispered in the dark. Daddy is going to take care of everything. Mom is going to get the peace she deserves, and I swear on my life, you will never go cold again. That night, in that unforgiving hospital chair, the millionaire died, and a father was born. Alejandro watched over his daughter like a fierce sentinel, waiting for dawn to start rebuilding the ruins of the life he had destroyed. Yet the hardest trial was still ahead. Angelito was still hovering between life and death. Fate had not yet decided if it would extract the full price for Alejandro's sins. The cold, blue, fluorescent lights of the county morgue emitted a constant electric hum, a drone that seeped into the bones and amplified the terrifying silence. Alejandro stood paralyzed before a steel gurney, wearing a pristine black suit he had just purchased, though it felt as heavy as lead armor. Beside him, Mendoza the lawyer kept his head bowed in respect, clutching a portfolio to his chest like a shield. They found her just as you predicted, Don Alejandro, Mendoza murmured, his voice barely audible in the sterile room. She was lying in a ditch covered in dry leaves near mile marker 40 on the old highway. She had no identification. They were set to cremate her for a pauper's grave tomorrow morning. We made it just in time. Alejandro nodded, the words stuck in his throat like a knot of barbed wire. He gestured to the coroner, a weary, balding man waiting on the other side of the gurney. Please, Alejandro choked out. The coroner gently pulled back the white sheet. Alejandro gripped the metal edge of the table to keep from collapsing. There was Elena, 15 years later. But time had not been as kind to her as it had been to him. Her face was gaunt, the skin clinging to her bones from sickness and starvation. The hair he remembered as lustrous and full of flowers was now dull and gray. But the look on her face, that expression shattered him. It held a strange peace, an absolute serenity, as if she had died knowing she had completed her mission. Alejandro reached out a trembling hand and caressed the frozen cheek of the woman he had loved and discarded. You did it, didn't you, Elena? He whispered, his tears falling onto the sterile sheet. They made it. Maribel is beautiful. She has your chin. And the baby is a fighter. He leaned down and kissed her cold forehead, a kiss of goodbye, but also a solemn vow. Mendoza, Alejandro said, straightening his back and wiping away his tears with sudden fury. The grief was transforming into an unstoppable force. I want her dressed in the finest materials, white silk. I want roses, thousands of them. Fill every corner of the church. And I want her interred in the Montoya family crypt. Mendoza's eyes widened in shock. Don Alejandro, the family crypt? That hallowed ground is reserved strictly for the ancestors, our fathers and grandfathers. If I lay her to rest there, I tell the world she was mine, Alejandro roared, his voice bouncing off the tiled walls. And she was more my wife than any woman I ever bound myself to legally. Just get it done. Publish the obituary in every paper in town. Elena Montoya, beloved mother and wife. Let there be no doubt. 2 days later, the entire town ground to a halt for the service. This wasn't just a funeral. It was open rebellion against the very social hierarchy Alejandro had spent a lifetime upholding. Every pew in the cathedral was packed. The curious high society crowd showed up for the gossip, but the poor came to honor the woman they knew in her darkest times. The scent of 5,000 white roses was thick enough to make your head spin. Center stage lay a hand-carved mahogany casket, gleaming under the candlelight. A final resting place fit for royalty. Alejandro occupied the front pew, but he didn't sit alone. Beside him sat Maribel, still frail and confined to a wheelchair. She wore a black velvet gown Alejandro had commissioned and tailored within 24 hours. Her hair, now clean and lustrous, was pulled back neatly with a simple black ribbon. She gripped her father's hand like a lifeline, her eyes wide as she gazed at the casket. She had never seen anything so beautiful. "Is Mommy inside?" Maribel whispered. "Yes, sweetheart. She's resting on a bed of silk," Alejandro murmured, leaning close. "It looks like a treasure chest," the child observed. "That's because it holds the greatest treasure I ever found, and the greatest one I ever lost," he choked out. The service proceeded with sacred weight until the priest raised his hand for the final benediction. Suddenly, a ripple of whispers started at the church entrance. The sharp clack of high heels against stone shattered the silence. Isabella had arrived. She wore black, sure, but there was nothing respectful about it. She strutted down the center aisle like it was a fashion runway, oblivious to the horrified gasps, until she stopped directly in front of Alejandro. "This is an absolute circus, Alejandro," she hissed, loud enough for the first 10 rows to catch every word. "Burying some homeless woman at the main altar? You've lost your mind. The senator is livid. You've humiliated me." The priest froze, hand still raised. A terrifying absolute silence descended upon the congregation. Alejandro gently released Maribel's hand and rose to his full height. He turned slowly to face Isabella. No anger twisted his features, only a deadly stillness, like the eye of a hurricane. "Isabella," he said, his voice projecting with ice-cold clarity, "you are in the house of God, at the funeral of my daughter's mother. You have 5 seconds to turn around and walk out. If you don't, I swear on Elena's memory, I will have you dragged out." "You wouldn't dare," she challenged, though she took a nervous step back. "I'm your fiancé, and that brat is just a bastard you plucked out of the garbage." In that instant, Maribel, the child who had been shivering in a doghouse just days before, did something that made the whole room hold its breath. She climbed out of her wheelchair, wobbled for a second, and stood tall beside her father. Gripping Alejandro's hand, she lifted her chin and stared down the intruder with the same fierce intensity as her father. "My mommy wasn't trash," Maribel announced, her crystalline voice echoing up to the dome. "She was an angel. And you're wicked." A ripple of agreement swept through the pews. In that heartbeat, the very high society Isabella worshipped turned its back on her. They saw true nobility in the child, and nothing but vulgarity in the wealthy socialite. Alejandro looked down at his daughter, his chest swelling with pride. He then looked up, locking eyes with his security team at the back. "Get her out of here," Alejandro commanded. 2 massive guards immediately started up the aisle. Realizing he wasn't bluffing, Isabella shrieked in indignation. She tried to retreat with some shred of grace, but it was too late. She was marched out of the church under the condemning glare of the entire town. Alejandro sank back into his seat, wrapping his arms around Maribel. "You did good, sweetheart. Real good," he whispered. "Mommy told me I had to be brave," she replied softly. Later, as the casket was lowered into the earth of the estate's private cemetery, beneath the same ancient oaks that had watched Alejandro grow up, he felt a fractured part of his soul begin to knit back together. He tossed the first handful of dirt, then stepped back to let Maribel drop a single white rose into the grave. "Goodbye, Mommy," she said, and for the first time, her eyes remained dry. She knew her mother was at peace, and she knew she was safe now, too. But the tranquility was short-lived. Just as Alejandro was helping Maribel into the car for the ride back to the hospital, his phone began to ring. It was Valladares calling. Alejandro picked up, a knot of ice instantly tightening in his gut. "Talk to me, Roberto." "Alejandro, you need to get here, now. It's the baby. His kidneys just shut down. He's fading." The earth seemed to stop spinning. The hollow triumph of the funeral evaporated, replaced instantly by the savage truth of life and death. Alejandro locked eyes with Maribel. Terror was written all over her face. "Is it my little brother?" She didn't need an answer. She knew. Alejandro scooped her up, to hell with funeral etiquette, and sprinted for the armored SUV. "Yeah, honey, we've got one more fight in us. Hold on tight." The drive back was a blur of raw speed and panic, a violent contrast to the slow, dignified procession to the graveyard. One hand on the wheel, the other crushing Maribel's fingers. She sat in the passenger seat, whispering the same prayers her mother had taught her for the darkest nights, over and over like a mantra. Bursting into the pediatric ICU, the energy in the room hit them like a physical blow. Gone was the uneasy silence of the last few days. It had been replaced by pure, frantic chaos. Alarms screamed from inside the glass enclosure where Angelito lay. A swarm of 3 nurses and 2 doctors hovered over the open incubator. Alejandro slammed his palms against the cold glass partition. The sight inside stopped his heart cold. The infant, who had looked peaceful just days ago, was now terribly swollen. His skin had turned a waxy, jaundiced yellow, and he was wired up with more tubes than Alejandro could track. A massive turning machine beside the crib was pumping blood out of that tiny body, filtering it and forcing it back in. Yet the heart monitor showed a jagged, erratic line, weak spikes barely fighting gravity. Dr. Valladares stepped out of the enclosure, peeling off a soiled surgical mask. He shook his head before saying a word, a gesture that nearly brought Alejandro to his knees. "Total renal collapse, Alejandro," the doctor said, delivering the news without a shred of sugarcoating. "Sepsis has set in. It's a cascade failure, one organ after another. The dialysis can't keep up." "Fix it!" Alejandro roared, seizing the doctor by his lab coat lapels. "Transplant him. Take mine. Take both of them. I don't care. Cut me open right now." "It's not that simple." Valladares shoved him back hard. "He's a newborn, barely 3 kilograms. You can't just shove an adult organ into an infant, especially not in this condition. The anesthesia alone would kill him." "Then what?" Alejandro whispered, crumbling to his knees before the glass doors. "You're telling—" "He needs a massive transfusion. Whole blood, platelets, the works. But his blood type is incredibly rare, a B negative, and the hospital bank is completely dry on that specific type. We requested a chopper from the Red Cross, but that's 2 hours away. He doesn't have 2 hours. He has 20 minutes. Alejandro scrambled to his feet, ripping off his gold cufflinks and sending them clattering down the hallway as he rolled up the sleeves of his black morning shirt. "I'm negative." Valladares stared at him, a flicker of desperate hope lighting up his exhausted eyes. "Are you certain?" "Damn it, Roberto. I know my own blood. I banked it for my surgeries at your private clinic. Check the file. It's me. It's my blood running through him. That's why he's my grandson." Valladares didn't hesitate. "Camila!" he screamed at the nurse's station. "Prep." No time for cross-matching. No time for safety questionnaires or paperwork. This was battlefield medicine. They shoved Alejandro onto a gurney right next to Angelito's incubator. Maribel, "Don't be scared, princess," Alejandro mouthed through the glass, forcing a smile through his own panic. "I'm giving him my strength." He lied to comfort her. "We already share this strength." Then, the blood began to move. Dark, vital fluid left the body of a man who had lived solely for himself for 50 years. It raced through the clear tubing, warmed by the machine, and rushed into the fragile, tiny veins of his grandson. Alejandro couldn't take his eyes off the line. He watched his own life essence drain out and pour into Angelito. A wave of dizziness hit him, not from blood loss, but from something spiritual shifting inside him. "Take it all, son," Alejandro whispered, eyes squeezing shut. "Drain me dry if you have to. Just live." As the blood pumped out of him, Alejandro started talking. Not to the doctors, but to someone higher up, a conversation he hadn't had since he was a little boy. "God, I know I'm not exactly on your VIP list. I've been an arrogant bastard my whole life. I hoarded acres I never walked and amassed fortunes I never spent. I let Elena die. The guilt is mine. I own that." The infant's heart monitor screamed a flatline warning. "We're losing him," the nurse yelled. "Adrenaline stat!" Alejandro roared from his gurney, fighting to rise against the needle anchored in his arm. "Don't you dare leave, Angelito. Don't you dare." Baladeras began chest compressions, thumbs pressing deep. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Alejandro clenched his jaw until it ached. Tears traced a path from his temples down to his ears. "God, let's make a deal. Take it all. Burn it to the ground. Let the estate crumble. Drain every penny. Just don't take this boy. Swap us out. Take my life. I'm offering it right now. But let him live." The room fell into a tomb-like silence, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and Valladares's sharp commands. "Come on, little one, come on," the doctor whispered. On the other side of the glass, Maribel pressed her palms against the pane and began to sing. It was an old cradle song, the very same melody Elena used to hum to her. Her voice, thin and cracked with weeping, somehow drifted through the heavy doors. "Sleep, my little dark one. Mama is in the fields." Alejandro turned his head to see his daughter singing. In that moment, he felt that a child's love was the most potent force in the cosmos. Suddenly, the green line on the monitor spiked. Beep. Everyone held their breath. Beep. Faint, but undeniable. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm found its steady groove. The baby's ashen skin began to flush, ever so slowly, as his grandfather's rich, strong blood flooded his collapsed veins, delivering oxygen, platelets, and life itself. Balladares ceased the compressions, stared at the screen, then looked at Alejandro, exhaled, and slumped onto a stool. "He's back," the doctor said, his voice shaking from the adrenaline dump. "Sinus rhythm is normal. Pressure is rising. Your blood gave him the kickstart he needed." Alejandro felt his remaining strength drain away. The edges of his vision went dark. He had donated nearly twice the safe limit due to the emergency. He was lightheaded, exhausted, hollowed out. Yet as his eyes drifted shut, sliding into unconsciousness, a peace he had never found in his featherbed washed over him. He had kept his vow. His debt was paid in blood. The last thing he heard before the blackout was Maribel screaming, "Daddy, Daddy! Angelito moved his hand!" And in the velvet darkness of his mind, Alejandro saw Elena smiling. Alejandro didn't wake up with a start. It was a slow, heavy ascent, like surfacing from the bottom of a dense, dark ocean. The first sensation was a stinging ache inside his left elbow, a physical receipt for the sacrifice he had just made. Then came the scent. The stench of death and fear was gone, replaced by lavender and crisp, clean linens. He struggled to open his eyes. Golden afternoon light filtered through the hospital blinds, illuminating dancing dust motes in the air. He blinked rapidly, trying to bring the room into focus. When the blur cleared, the sight took his breath away. Maribel was there, neither playing nor sleeping. She sat perched on a high chair beside his bed, chin resting in her palms, watching him with a quiet, vigilant intensity. Her honey-colored eyes, identical to his own, were wide and alert. Seeing her father stir, a shy smile, the first genuine one Alejandro had ever seen on her face, lit up the room. "You're awake," the girl whispered, as if afraid to break the spell of tranquility. Alejandro tried to sit up, but a wave of vertigo slammed him back down against the pillows. He felt depleted, frail, as if they had drawn not just blood, but years of vitality from his body. Strangely, however, his soul felt fuller than ever. Where is Angelito?" he asked, his voice rough and dry. Panic tried to claw its way back into his chest. Maribel stood up with a maturity far beyond her 9 years, took a cup of water with a straw, and guided it to Alejandro's lips. "Drink, Daddy. The doctor said you need lots of fluids." Alejandro drank eagerly, feeling the cool liquid revive his parched throat. When he finished, Maribel set the cup down and wrapped her small hands around his large, calloused one. "Angelito is okay," she said, her eyes welling up, though these were tears of relief. "The doctor said your magic blood woke him up. He isn't gray anymore. He's all pink now, and they took a lot of the tubes away." Alejandro closed his eyes and let out a shuddering breath. A single tear escaped, rolling down his temple and vanishing into the pillow. "Thank heavens," the doctor had muttered earlier. "You drained yourself dry for him. Running on empty doesn't even begin to cover it." Maribel kept stroking the back of her father's hand. "Why would you do that? You could have died right there with him." Alejandro turned to face her. He didn't just see Elena in her face. He saw the innocence, sure, but he also saw the iron will of a survivor. "Because that is the job, Maribel," he cracked, his voice fracturing under the emotional weight. "Parents give everything. You bleed for your kids until the last drop runs out." I wasn't there to provide for your mom when she needed me. I wasn't there to feed you when you were starving. But I swear on everything holy, as long as there is a single drop of blood left in this body, you will never want for anything again. Maribel lowered her eyes, idly playing with Alejandro's fingers. "Mom told me a story once," she said softly. "She said my papa was a king fighting dragons far away, and that's why he couldn't come home. She said the day you came back, the dragons would leave forever." Alejandro felt a sharp, physical stake drive through his heart. Elena, in her infinite kindness, had spun his cowardice and abandonment into a hero's legend just to protect her daughter's heart. "Your mother, she was a saint, Maribel. I wasn't slaying dragons. I was lost. I was blind." Alejandro squeezed his daughter's hand. "Forgive me, mija. Forgive me for not coming for you sooner. For letting you endure the cold." Maribel studied him intensely, then leaned in with infinite tenderness to kiss Alejandro's forehead. "I forgive you, Daddy," she whispered. "Mom said when I found you, I had to love you a lot because you'd be very sad and lonely in your big castle." And she was right. You were sad. But not anymore. That forgiveness, granted with the absolute simplicity of a child, shattered the final chains binding Alejandro to his guilty past. He felt a mountain lift from his shoulders. "Let's go see him," Alejandro said, gritting his teeth as he tried to sit up. This time, his will overpowered the dizziness. "The doctor said stay down," Maribel protested. "I need to see him. I need to confirm it's real. Help me." Leaning on Maribel for support on his right and dragging the IV stand with his left, Alejandro shuffled slowly down the hall toward the NICU. Every step was a battle, but each one brought him closer to redemption. When they reached the glass, the scene had changed completely. Little Angel wasn't in the closed incubator anymore. He was resting in an open warming crib. The monitors were still there, but they beeped with a steady, strong rhythm. The sound of victory. Beep, beep, beep. The baby shifted. Tiny arms flailed in the air, grasping for purchase. And his skin, it had that healthy pink glow Alejandro had prayed to see. Dr. Valladares was inside, checking oxygen levels. Spotting Alejandro and Maribel at the window, he offered a tired, wide grin. He waved them in for a quick look. Alejandro entered, bracing himself on Maribel. They approached the crib.
Angelito opened his eyes. Dark, deep, inquisitive. He yawned, stretching out those microscopic hands.
Alejandro extended his index finger. Driven by pure instinct, the baby clamped his tiny fist around his grandfather's thick digit. The grip was surprisingly powerful. "Hey there, champ," Alejandro whispered, tears streaming freely. "Hi, my life. It's Grandpa. You're safe now." "Look, Papa," Maribel said, pointing to the monitor. "His heart beats faster when you talk. It's because he knows we're his pack," Alejandro replied, unable to look away from the miracle before him. "He knows he carries our blood." In that moment, inside a hospital room filled with machines and blinking lights, Alejandro Montoya learned the most vital lesson of his existence. He understood that his millions, his land, his thoroughbreds, and his white pillared mansion were worth absolutely nothing compared to the warmth of that tiny hand squeezing his finger. He had spent a lifetime hoarding wealth, trying to fill a void, never knowing the real treasure had been waiting on a dusty road, inside an old backpack, and in the arms of a brave girl. Valladares walked over and placed a hand on Alejandro's shoulder. "It's a medical miracle, Alejandro. But it's something else, too. His recovery defies explanation. Yesterday, he was a lost cause. Today, his kidneys kicked in on their own. It's like he decided to stay." "He didn't just decide to stay, Roberto," Alejandro corrected, looking at Maribel. "He decided not to leave us alone because we have work to do. We have a life to live." Alejandro turned to his daughter and painfully knelt to meet her eyes. "Maribel, listen to me very carefully. Once we walk out those doors, everything changes. We're going to take that massive, soulless house and flood it with warmth. It's going to be filled with the flowers Mom adored. We'll throw the shutters wide open, and I promise you, not a single soul will ever tell you that you don't belong again. This kingdom belongs to you and little Angel now." Maribel beamed, and in that expression, Alejandro saw a glimpse of tomorrow. "But what about the wicked lady?" the little girl whispered. For a heartbeat, Alejandro's eyes turned to flint, but the hardness melted away just as quickly. Isabella wasn't even worth his anger anymore. She was nothing. "She doesn't exist in our reality, sweetheart. The monsters have all been chased away. It's just us now." The three of them locked together, a frail but joyful grandfather, a courageous girl, and a baby, given a second chance, forging an unbreakable bond. It was a fortress of the heart, something no amount of wealth could purchase and no tragedy could ever shatter again. 12 months later, the afternoon glow draped over the Los Alamos estate, but the light had lost the cruel, burning edge from that terrible day. Instead, the sunshine felt like liquid gold, gentle and welcoming as it trickled through the people, boughs of the saplings and fruit trees that now lined the long driveway. The grounds had been completely reimagined. Gone was the pristine, sterile lawn that looked good but was forbidden to touch. In its place was a beautiful, chaotic celebration of life. A brightly painted playhouse stood proudly next to the main fountain. Toy trikes lay scattered on the cobblestone path, but the biggest change was the house itself. The towering white pillars of the manor, which once loomed like the bars of a gilded cage, were now draped in jasmine and bougainvillea vines, softening the stone and scenting the breeze with sweet, heady perfume. The air was alive with sound, the strum of live folk guitars, belly laughs, and the clinking of glassware. A massive white tent in the backyard hosted the festivities. This wasn't one of those stuffy, pretentious galas Isabella used to throw for politicians and banking tycoons. No, this was a genuine celebration. It was a melting pot of humanity. Ranch hands with their families, hospital staff, with Dr. Valladares sitting at the head table, Maribel's new schoolmates darting around, and yes, even a few business associates who had realized that working with Alejandro meant accepting his new worldview. And right in the middle of the action, waddling after a red balloon drifting on the breeze, was little Angel. The 1-year-old was a hurricane of energy.
chubby cheeks, dark curls, and sturdy legs that carried him across the grass with a determined, if slightly wobbly, run. He sported a miniature white linen outfit that was already decorated with grass stains and smears of chocolate cake. "Get it, Angel! Go, go!" cheered Maribel, who was now 10 years old. You wouldn't even recognize her. She had blossomed, shooting up like a wildflower in good soil. Her hair was glossy, woven into a neat, long braid, and her complexion glowed with the health of a child who finally slept soundly and ate well. Dressed in sky blue, she chased her brother with a laugh that rang out pure and free. The crushing weight of the world finally lifted from her small shoulders. Lounging in a garden chair, sipping a glass of lemonade and taking it all in, sat Alejandro. The tight Italian tailoring and silk ties were gone. Instead, he wore broken-in denim, an unbuttoned linen shirt, and his old work boots. He looked older, certainly. The silver in his hair had spread, and the creases around his eyes were more pronounced. But they weren't scars of bitterness anymore. They were etchings of joy. In spirit, the man looked 10 years younger. "Don Alejandro," Ramirez, the foreman, interrupted, approaching with respect but a newfound warmth. "The beef is off the grill. Shall we start serving?" "Absolutely, Ramirez. Feed everyone. And make sure to run extra plates down to the bunkhouse for the guys on watch duty. Today is about celebrating life." Alejandro stood up and wandered toward a quiet corner of the grounds. In the very spot where that rotting wooden shack had once stood, where he had discovered his children, there was now a sanctuary. The soil had been turned and replaced with a bed of hundreds of white roses, all blooming with breathtaking vibrancy. Anchoring the floral display was a white marble bench and a small cherub statue. A polished bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight. Elena's garden. Here bloomed the love that saved this family. Your sacrifice gave us life. Alejandro stepped closer, brushing his hand over the sun-warmed metal. "Look at this, Elena," he whispered, conversing with her as he did every single day. "Look at our grandson. He's walking. He's built like an ox, but he has your smile. And Maribel? She's top of her class. She's the happiest little girl on earth." A breeze rustled the bushes, dislodging a single white petal that drifted down to rest on Alejandro's shoulder. He smiled, accepting the caress. "I kept my promise, my love. They want for nothing. But you gave me the one thing I never realized I was missing. Thank you for bringing them to me. For your forgiveness." "Grandpa! Grandpa!" The sharp cry pierced his moment of reflection. Alejandro spun around to see little Angelito sprinting toward him full tilt, arms flung wide, with Maribel hot on his heels. "Uppy, uppy!" the boy begged, crashing into his legs and clinging on tight. Alejandro stooped down, letting out an exaggerated groan of exertion before hoisting the boy high into the air. Angelito shrieked with laughter, snatching his grandfather's hat and jamming it crookedly onto his own head. "Easy there, cowboy. That's the boss's hat," Alejandro teased, planting a kiss on the boy's chubby cheek. Maribel reached them, wrapping an arm around Alejandro's waist and resting her head against his chest. "Were you talking to Mom?" she asked, glancing at the roses. "I was, sweetheart, telling her how beautiful you all look today." "I think she's watching us," Maribel said, looking up at the clear blue sky. "I bet she loves the party." Alejandro pulled Maribel close with his free arm, holding his whole world together under the afternoon sun. "She does, my love, because finally, after all this time, we are exactly where we're meant to be. Home." In the distance, Dr. Valadares raised his glass, offering a silent toast to Alejandro. Alejandro nodded, returning the salute. The camera begins a slow pullback, rising high above the gathering. The mansion transforms before our eyes, no longer a cold monument to vanity, but a living, breathing home. We see children chasing each other, guests feasting and laughing, and at the center of it all, a man who lost the world only to find his soul, standing in a garden of roses that bloomed from sorrow to become a symbol of hope. Fade to black as Angelito's laughter echoes, pure, timeless, and eternal. The end.